So this is the camera I've been waiting a long time for. Now, I love using my Sony FX3, but at times for the stuff I want to shoot, this camera is way too big. Sometimes you want to be discreet when you're filming, and this camera is pretty much the opposite of that. I've been wanting to get a camera that is much smaller than the FX3 for filming videos, so I can have something that is a little bit more discreet and does not attract nearly as much attention. And then Sony announced the ZV-E10, and while it is much smaller than the FX3, you're still using the same full-frame sized lenses as the FX3. So for me, that would kind of defeat the purpose. So I've been waiting for Sony to announce an updated ZV-E10 that has 10-bit video. I knew it was only a matter of time since they released the FX30 and the A6700. Now it took a while, but it's finally here. Sony has loaned me this camera for the next couple weeks along with the brand new updated kit lens, so we're gonna go put this lens and this camera to the test and see if it would be worth adding to my kit to help me make better videos. Now obviously I don't expect this camera to outperform my FX3 in pretty much any way, but the compact size is nice and I'm curious to see just how well it holds up and if it could replace my FX3 entirely for filming my videos. I am just making YouTube videos after all. So I'm gonna go out and shoot some photos with the Sony a7CR, and I'm gonna use the ZV-E10 Mark II to film the process. In a second, I'm gonna switch over to the DJI microphone, but I just wanted to get an idea of how the onboard microphone of this camera performs. So the goal of this test is not to take the best photos that I've ever taken. If you've seen my previous videos, this is probably a familiar spot, but I'm just gonna walk around here, take some photos, and focus on getting B-roll with the ZV-E10 Mark II, and just kind of see how it performs. So for this part of the video, I am going to be shooting photos on the Sony a7CR with the 35mm 1.8. The reason I'm using this camera and not the ZV-E10 Mark II to shoot photos is because realistically, if I decide to buy this camera, I'm probably not ever going to take photos with the ZV-E10 Mark II. Plus, I don't think you can even edit the photos in Lightroom yet anyways. All right, so I have officially switched over to the DJI mic. Also, I almost forgot to mention the settings that I'm currently using for this camera. I currently have everything on full auto, so on the program setting, and I am shooting in S-Log. I'm not too concerned about the shutter speed and obeying the 180-degree shutter rule, especially for the kind of filming I do, where a lot of the time the camera is situated on a tripod and it's a static frame. I feel like in those scenarios, the 180-degree shutter rule does not matter nearly as much. As for the settings on my Sony a7CR, the aperture is set to f4, and then the shutter speed is variable depending on the lighting. So I hope the auto exposure is doing a decent job. To me, I can't tell if it's the brightness on the monitor, but it looks like some of the shots might be a little bit underexposed. As of right now, I have it set to overexposed by about 0.7 stops. And I guess right now we can get a decent idea of how the stabilization is on this camera and this lens. Since the camera has no IBIS, it's completely reliant on, wait for that car to pass, it's completely reliant on the optical steady shot of the lens, which if I had to guess, it might be decent, but I don't expect it to be too great. It also helps that I currently have the camera attached to a tripod. I will also note that it's about 86 degrees out currently and the camera is getting quite hot, but the camera has not overheated yet. I do like this framing and composition of the railroad tracks with the bridge and the city in the background, but there's not really much of a subject besides the bridge and the railroad tracks in the city. Now it would be great if the train was coming along, but I don't have time to wait around for that. One thing to also note with the stabilization of this camera, yes, you can use active steady shot, but with the kit lens, which is equal to about a 24 to I think 75 millimeter full frame equivalent, if you use the active steady shot, the 24 millimeters becomes about a 30 millimeter or so because it's a 1.4 times crop compared to about a 1.1 times crop on full frame cameras like the A7 IV, the FX3, A7S III. All right, so I think we're pretty much done shooting at this location. So here in a minute, we're gonna head off to the next spot. But I think over the past hour of filming this so far with the ZV-E10 Mark II, it's pretty safe to say that I could easily replace the FX3 and use this camera to film my videos. Number one, it's obviously much more low-key and discreet compared to the FX3, but it's also much easier to set up and frame compositions and carry around, and I don't get nearly as tired nearly as quickly, which is obviously a plus. And I have no doubt that the video quality can stand up to the FX3 for the most part, especially here in broad daylight. I guess the real question would probably be, how does it stand up in low light? All right, we've made it to the last spot I want to shoot. I recently discovered this spot. This is one of those spots where it's just a photo just waiting to happen. Sadly, the sun is out a little bit more right now than I would have originally liked. Finding locations like this one here in my city is actually extremely rare, especially with this car parked out front. It just makes for the perfect subject. And finding a spot like this is truly a gem, and I'm trying to make sure I photograph it as much as I possibly can, especially before they decide to move this car out front, which makes the perfect subject with this building. I am super excited to edit those photos, which I guess you've already seen. But I just finished shooting here. I think we've shot all we're gonna shoot today. So I'm gonna head back, edit the video, edit the photos, and we'll talk a little bit more about this camera and what I think so far. All right, I have gone through and edited all of the photos and the video that I've shot with the ZV-E10 Mark II. So let's talk about this camera a little bit. And not to much surprise, this camera is fully capable of shooting my photo walk videos exceptionally well, and in some ways I would say it's probably a lot better for filming my videos compared to the Sony FX3. I think there's a lot of scenarios where you would probably not be able to tell the difference between footage from the ZV-E10 Mark II in the Sony FX3 or any other 10-bit Sony camera that has been released in the past couple years. Especially given the fact that I film a lot of my videos where the camera is stationary on a tripod, the lack of IBIS might not be as big of a deal for me compared to other people who might be out vlogging and walking around with this camera more. Now, speaking of vlogging and IBIS, using a lens with optical steady shot is pretty much a must on this camera. Yet at the same time, having optical steady shot felt pointless because it doesn't even feel like it makes much of a difference without IBIS, since they work so well in conjunction with each other. So I think most people will probably want to use active stabilization to compensate for the lack of IBIS, but at that point, the kit lens kind of becomes useless. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, most Sony cameras that come with active stabilization do about a 1.1 times crop. This camera does a 1.4 times crop. So when you're shooting with the kit lens wide open at 16mm, which is a 24mm full frame equivalent, and then you apply that 1.4 times crop on top of that, you're shooting at close to a 35mm focal range. And 24mm is already probably the tightest I would go for vlogging, so 35mm is pretty much not even an option. So I would personally recommend skipping the kit lens and picking up something like the classic 10 to 18mm or the newer 10 to 20mm lens. They both have optical steady shot as well, and when you're shooting pretty much as wide as you can go at 10mm, which is a 15mm full frame equivalent, apply the 1.4 times crop, which would give you a vlogging focal length of about 21mm, which I would say is pretty much perfect. I wish I had one of those lenses here with me right now, but since I personally don't own any APS-C lenses, I haven't had any need to buy one of those. But for my use case, as you can tell by watching the video, the kit lens was more than good enough. So everything that I filmed, I shot with this camera in the program mode, so I let it decide my aperture, shutter speed, and my ISO. I set the exposure compensation to overexpose by about 0.7 stops, so I had my full trust on this camera to let it expose for each frame, and it actually did a pretty good job. In the one area where I was probably the least impressed was definitely the onboard microphone. It wasn't bad, and it didn't really pick up any of the background noise like I actually expected it to. I just wasn't very impressed. So given that my expectations were not set too high, you can't expect a $1,000 camera to outperform a $3,500 camera, obviously. But considering what I'm doing is just filming YouTube videos, I think the ZV-E10 Mark II would pair perfectly with my FX3, and if I'm being completely honest, it could fully replace my FX3 for probably 95% of what I film, because rarely do I ever actually film in low light anyways. I thought I would be in denial at just how well this camera actually stacks up to the FX3, but I think it's actually a great thing, especially for newer creators who can't afford an expensive camera like that, and just know that you're not missing out on quite as much as you actually think you are just because you can't afford that really expensive camera. Now, I don't think I would ever sell my FX3 and fully replace it with this camera. The low light capabilities of the FX3 is something I don't think I could ever let go of, along with the IBIS and the depth of field that comes with a full frame sensor. Yet at the same time, I'm kind of conflicted. I never thought a small, affordable, kind of cheap feeling camera would make me rethink how I film my videos. So will I buy this camera? At the moment, I'm not in a rush to buy it, as beneficial as I think it could be for my videos, but I certainly think one day down the road I probably will. So I did not cover everything I possibly could about this camera, pretty much just what is relevant to me, because there are plenty of other videos online that you can go watch where you can learn everything you need to know about this camera. But just let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments down below. So thanks for watching the video, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to help support me, and I hope I could inspire you guys to get out and take more photos. Go out and shoot.